What would you do if the law took away your best friend? Not because they did anything wrong, but because of how they looked. Welcome to Vale Marks, where we bring you the most gripping emotional stories that touch the soul and leave you thinking long after the video ends. Today we tell the incredible journey of Goliath, a giant pit bull, and his 7-year-old owner, Noah, a boy who refused to let an unfair law steal the only friend who truly understood him. Pit bulls have long been one of the most misunderstood dog breeds in the world. Despite their loyalty, intelligence, and unwavering love for their families, they are banned in many places simply because of stigma and fear. But is a dog dangerous because of its breed or because of how we treat them? Before we begin, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps me reach 1,000 followers and continue creating heartfelt, meaningful stories just like this one. This is more than just a story. It's a lesson about justice, love, and the power of never giving up. Stay with me until the very end to witness the incredible twist that changed everything. Now, let's begin. Goliath had always known love. It was in the warmth of Noah's small hands as they wrapped around his massive neck. It was in the way the boy whispered secrets into his ear, soft words only meant for the pit bull who never judged, never questioned, only listened. To Goliath, Noah was his world. And to Noah, Goliath was everything: a guardian, a friend, a silent protector against the things he didn't understand. Noah was different from other children. At 7 years old, he lived in a world that often felt too loud, too bright, too confusing. But Goliath made everything better. When the chaos of the outside world overwhelmed him, Noah found solace in the steady rhythm of Goliath's breathing, in the softness of his fur, in the quiet understanding that only the two of them shared. Goliath never pulled away, never flinched when Noah buried his face into his side, seeking comfort after a difficult day. The boy's parents, Sarah and James Miller, often watched with quiet gratitude, knowing their son had found a companion who didn't need words to understand him. The world outside their home, however, didn't see what they saw. To the neighbors, to the strangers who passed by their yard, Goliath was not a friend. He was a threat. A giant pit bull, his broad chest and powerful stance were enough to make people cross the street. Whispers followed them whenever Sarah took him for a walk, murmurs of dangerous breed, of unpredictable, of those dogs turn on their owners. It didn't matter that Goliath had never so much as growled at another person. It didn't matter that his days were spent lounging beside Noah, letting the boy drape toy necklaces over his neck or fall asleep against his belly. The world had already made up its mind about dogs like him. For years, the Millers had ignored the talk. They knew the truth. They had seen Goliath stand guard at Noah's bedside when the boy was sick. They had watched him nudge toys closer when Noah seemed too overwhelmed to reach for them himself. They had witnessed the way his presence had transformed their son's life. But the world had rules, and those rules were about to change. It started with a letter. A single piece of paper slipped into their mailbox one morning, carrying the weight of an impossible decision. Sarah's hands shook as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words that spelled doom for their family. A new ordinance had been passed, an outright ban on pit bulls within their district. No exceptions, no appeals. Any family found keeping a pit bull past the designated deadline would have their dog seized and relocated. The letter was clear. They had 2 weeks to remove Goliath from their home, or he would be taken. Sarah read the words over and over, willing them to change. She felt James step behind her, reading the letter over her shoulder, his body tensing with the same disbelief, the same quiet fury. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing to say. How could they explain to their son that the law did not see Goliath the way he did? That the dog who had been his constant companion, his anchor in a world that often felt too overwhelming, was suddenly illegal? Noah found them standing in the kitchen, the letter crumpled between Sarah's fingers. He tilted his head, his bright eyes shifting between his parents. "What's wrong?" he asked, his small voice cutting through the thick silence. Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out. She looked at James, desperate for an answer, but he was just as lost. Finally, she knelt in front of her son, reaching for his hand. "Noah, sweetheart, there's a new rule," she began slowly, carefully choosing her words. "A rule about dogs." Noah's grip on her hand tightened. "What about dogs?" Sarah hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment press down on her. "Some people don't think pit bulls should live in our neighborhood anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah's brows furrowed. He looked toward the doorway, where Goliath lay stretched out on the floor, his head resting on his massive paws. "But Goliath's not people," he said, as if that simple truth would be enough to undo the cruel reality. "I know, baby," Sarah whispered. "I know." James knelt beside them, running a hand over his face. "They're making us give him up, Noah," he said softly, voice thick with unspoken rage. "If we don't, they'll take him." For a long moment, Noah didn't move. He didn't blink. His little fingers curled into fists, his breath coming quicker, shallower. Then, without a word, he turned and ran straight to Goliath. The pit bull lifted his head, ears perking as the boy flung himself against his side, small arms wrapping around his thick neck. "No," Noah said, his voice muffled against Goliath's fur. "No, no, no." Goliath didn't understand the words, but he understood the boy's heartbeat, the way it pounded too fast against his chest. He understood the tremble in Noah's hands as they gripped him tighter. He licked the child's cheek, a soft, reassuring gesture, but it only made Noah sob harder. James reached for his wife's hand, gripping it tightly as they watched their son break. The fight wasn't over yet, but time was running out. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the quiet suburban street into a blurred, shimmering nightmare. The flashing red and blue lights of the enforcement vehicle cast eerie reflections on the wet pavement, their rotating beams illuminating the tear-streaked face of a little boy standing in the doorway of the Miller home. Noah clung to Goliath with all the strength his small body could muster, his tiny fingers gripping the thick, warm fur of his best friend, as if he could hold him in place through sheer will. His face was buried in the dog's neck, his sobs muffled against Goliath's body. The pit bull, massive and powerful, stood utterly still, his wide brown eyes darting between the strangers in uniforms and the little boy who smelled like home. Two men in dark raincoats stood in the yard, their expressions unreadable beneath the shadows cast by their caps. One of them held a clipboard, the other a leash. Behind them, the large truck idled, its open doors a silent promise that this was not a negotiation. "Ma'am," the man with the clipboard said, shifting uncomfortably as Sarah Miller stood between him and her dog. Her face was pale, lips pressed into a firm line, but her eyes were burning. James stood at her side, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white. "You don't have to do this," Sarah said, her voice wavering but filled with quiet fury. "This is our family. He is our family." The officer sighed. "I understand, ma'am, but the law is the law. If you don't comply, we will have to—" "You don't understand," James snapped, stepping forward. "This isn't some wild animal. This is Goliath. He has never hurt anyone. My son—" He gestured toward Noah, who was still gripping the dog, now trembling from both fear and the cold rain soaking through his pajamas. "My son needs him. He is not just a pet." The officer glanced at the other man, shifting uncomfortably again. "I wish it didn't have to be this way, but we have orders. If you refuse to surrender him, we are authorized to remove him by force." The leash in the second officer's hand jingled softly as he stepped forward. "No!" Noah's scream shattered the night. He tightened his grip around Goliath's neck, his small arms shaking. "You can't take him! He's my best friend! You can't!" His voice broke, cracking under the weight of his fear. "Please," he whispered this time, turning his face up to the officers, his blue eyes glistening with desperate tears. "Please don't take him." The man hesitated, just for a moment, but then he exhaled, shoulders sagging as he knelt in front of the boy. "Kid, I'm sorry. I really am. But I have a job to do." Then, with swift, practiced movements, he reached forward, slipping the leash over Goliath's broad head. The pit bull tensed. He didn't snarl. He didn't growl. He didn't fight. He simply stood there, unmoving, his eyes shifting between the boy and the man pulling at the leash. Noah screamed again, this time more frantic, his fingers gripping at Goliath's fur. But he was small, and they were strong. Sarah's knees nearly gave out as she watched them pull Goliath away, his claws slipping against the wet ground as he struggled to stay where he belonged. James grabbed her hand, grounding her even as his own face was tight with barely restrained rage. The moment the leash tightened, Noah completely lost control. He threw himself against the officer's legs, beating his tiny fists against him, kicking, fighting with every ounce of strength he had. "No! No! You can't take him! Please! Mom! Dad! Don't let them take him!" But Sarah and James were frozen. Because what could they do? What could they possibly do? And then, for the first time in his short life, Noah did something he had never done before. He looked at Goliath, his best friend, his protector, and screamed so loudly that the neighbors' lights flickered on down the street. "I hate you!" He wasn't speaking to Goliath. He was speaking to the men, to the law, to the world that had decided that his dog was a monster when all he had ever been was love. Goliath didn't understand. He only knew that the little boy was in pain. He let out a low whimper, his head dipping slightly as if he wanted to run back to him, to nuzzle against him, to lick away the tears. But the leash held firm, dragging him toward the truck. Noah ran after him, his bare feet splashing through puddles, but James caught him before he could reach the vehicle. The boy thrashed wildly in his father's arms, screaming and sobbing as the truck doors closed. The last thing Goliath saw was Noah's tiny hand pressed against the rain-streaked window, his face twisted in grief. Then the truck pulled away. The Miller family stood in the storm, drenched, broken, watching as their world disappeared down the road. Goliath didn't fight the leash. He didn't bark. He simply sat there in the back of the truck, staring at the place where Noah had been. He didn't understand what had happened. He only knew one thing. His world was gone. The metal doors slammed shut behind Goliath, and the sound echoed through the cold, sterile corridors of the facility. The air smelled of antiseptic, wet fur, and something deeper, something Goliath couldn't name but could feel, a lingering, unshakable scent of fear. He had never been in a place like this before. The walls were lined with metal cages, stacked side by side like prison cells, each one occupied by a pair of desperate, weary eyes. Some of the dogs whimpered softly, others pressed themselves against the bars, tails tucked between their legs, ears flattened in silent defeat. Others had stopped reacting altogether, lying curled in the corners of their cages, staring at nothing. Goliath stood frozen as the leash tightened around his thick neck, tugging him forward. His paws scraped against the smooth concrete floor, and he hesitated, his body tense. The men leading him didn't care. They pulled harder, forcing him to move. He didn't understand. He had been in a warm house just hours ago, had felt the steady heartbeat of Noah against his fur, had dozed off to the sound of the boy's quiet breathing. Now he was here, surrounded by unfamiliar smells and desperate cries, trapped in a place that felt so wrong. A door clanged open. One of the men guiding him sighed heavily as they reached an empty cage near the end of the row. The worker, a man with tired eyes and an impassive expression, shook his head. Another one, huh? He clicked his tongue as he scanned the clipboard in his hands. Giant Pitbull. Well, you're not getting adopted, that's for sure. Goliath didn't flinch at the words. He didn't understand them. But the tone, the dismissiveness, the certainty in the man's voice settled into his bones like a heavy weight. The worker unlocked the cage and gave a small nod to his partner. The leash was removed, and before Goliath could process what was happening, he was shoved inside. The metal door clanged shut behind him, and the lock clicked into place. The men walked away without another glance. Goliath turned, pressing his nose against the bars, watching as their footsteps faded down the hall. Then he looked at the dogs around him. Some of them returned his gaze, their eyes hollow, empty. Others didn't even lift their heads. And that's when he understood. This was not a temporary place. This was not somewhere dogs left. He backed away from the door, his massive body pressing against the cold metal behind him. His breath came slow and measured, his tail curled slightly beneath him in unease. His ears flicked as he heard movement from the cage beside him. A small, wiry mutt with patchy fur and wide, frantic eyes was watching him. Unlike the other dogs, this one was trembling, his body pressed low to the ground. "They took Max this morning," the mutt whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of barking. "I don't think he's coming back." Goliath didn't move, didn't respond. He didn't know how to. The mutt swallowed hard. "They take them in the mornings, always the mornings, one by one," his voice cracked. "Then they don't come back." Goliath turned his head slightly, glancing down the corridor toward the locked doors. He could still hear the sounds of dogs beyond them, some barking, some whining, others silent. He didn't know what it meant, but it made his chest feel tight. A deep sigh came from the cage across from him. A gruff, older dog, his muzzle speckled with gray, lifted his head. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, of someone who had given up. "First time in the pound, huh?" the older dog muttered, his voice tired. Goliath hesitated, then gave the slightest dip of his head. The old dog huffed. "Don't get comfortable. You won't be here long." Something about the way he said it made Goliath's ears twitch. The mutt beside him whimpered. "But I don't want to go where Max went." The old dog didn't respond right away. He just stared at them for a long moment before finally saying, "Yeah." Neither did Max. A chill ran down Goliath's spine. Time passed in ways he couldn't track. The lights flickered off at some point, leaving the room in dim shadows. Somewhere down the hall, a dog howled, the sound stretching long and mournful into the night before abruptly cutting off. Goliath curled into himself, laying his head on his paws, but sleep didn't come. He thought of Noah, of the way the boy had clung to him, of the way his small hands had tried to hold him back, of the sound of his cries as the truck doors shut between them. A sharp pang went through Goliath's chest. He didn't belong here. He belonged with Noah, and yet, here he was, alone. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. Noah sat curled up on the floor of his bedroom, knees pulled tightly to his chest, staring at the corner where Goliath's bed used to be. The giant dog had barely fit in that spot, his massive frame spilling over onto the wooden floor. But he had always slept there anyway, close enough for Noah to reach out and bury his fingers into his thick fur whenever he woke from a bad dream. Now, there was only silence. Noah's fingers curled into the fabric of his pajama pants. He squeezed his eyes shut, but that only made the images behind his lids sharper. The truck's red taillights disappearing into the rain, Goliath's wide, confused eyes as he was pulled away, the overwhelming helplessness that had swallowed Noah whole as he screamed and screamed. But no one had listened. No one, except Goliath. Noah wiped his face roughly. He couldn't just sit here. He couldn't let them take Goliath away without a fight. His parents had tried to stop it, but the law didn't care about their words. The officials hadn't cared about his tears, but maybe someone else would. The idea struck him like a bolt of lightning, and before he had even fully thought it through, he was on his feet, scrambling for the box of art supplies in the corner of his room. Crayons and markers spilled across the floor as he dug for the thickest, boldest colors he could find. He grabbed a piece of paper, his small hands working furiously, the crayon gliding across the surface with a desperate urgency. He drew Goliath exactly how he remembered him, strong, kind, his big brown eyes full of warmth. At the top, he scrawled in large, uneven letters, "Please bring my best friend home." When he was finished, he sat back, staring at the paper. His chest ached, but for the first time in days, a spark of determination flickered through him. He ran out of his room, nearly colliding with his mother in the hallway. Sarah barely had time to catch him before he shoved the drawing into her hands. "Mom," Noah said, breathless, "we have to put these everywhere." Sarah looked down at the picture, her lips parting in silent surprise. Her eyes flickered over the shaky words, the desperate detail in Goliath's face, and something inside her cracked. "Oh, Noah," she whispered, kneeling so she could meet his eyes. "I'm not giving up," Noah said firmly, shaking his head. "Goliath wouldn't give up on me, so I'm not giving up on him." A lump formed in Sarah's throat, but she swallowed hard, pushing through the wave of emotions crashing over her. Her son was right. She had spent days feeling powerless, but maybe, just maybe, they weren't out of options yet. She nodded. "Okay," she said. "Let's do it." Noah's face lit up, and he ran back to his room, grabbing more sheets of paper. He worked tirelessly, sketching Goliath again and again, each drawing carrying the same message. "Help me bring Goliath home." By the time the sun rose the next morning, they had stacks of posters. Noah and Sarah went out into town, taping them to telephone poles, storefront windows, and bus stops. Noah pressed them into the hands of strangers, his small voice unwavering as he pleaded, "Please, help me save my best friend." People stopped. They looked at the posters. Some of them hesitated, glancing down at the little boy with the determined eyes, and something in their expressions softened. By the end of the day, whispers of Goliath's story had started to spread. But Noah didn't stop there. Sarah, watching her son's determination, knew they needed to do more. That night, she picked up her phone and started recording. She filmed Noah standing beside his drawings, his voice small but steady as he told their story. "My name is Noah," he said, looking directly into the camera. "And this is my best friend Goliath." Sarah cut to a video of Goliath and Noah playing in the backyard, the big dog letting the little boy climb all over him, his massive tail wagging like a flag in the wind. "They took him away from me," Noah continued. "They said he was dangerous, but he's not. He's kind. He loves me. And now he's gone." The next clip was of the posters they had put up, the words, "Please bring Goliath home," lingering on the screen for a long moment. "Please help me," Noah finished, his voice thick with emotion. "Please help me bring him home." Sarah hesitated before pressing upload, but then she took a deep breath and did it. She had no idea how much that one video would change everything. At first, there was nothing. Then, slowly, the views started creeping up. Dozens turned into hundreds, then thousands. And then, something incredible happened. People started sharing it. Comments poured in, strangers offering words of support, others tagging organizations that fought against breed-specific laws. The story reached a group of animal rights activists, and they took notice. Within days, their inbox was flooded with messages from people who wanted to help. Reporters started calling. An attorney specializing in animal rights reached out, offering to fight for Goliath's return. And just like that, a movement began. The town that had once looked at Goliath with wary eyes was now buzzing with conversations. The people who had crossed the street to avoid him were now arguing against the unfairness of the law. Noah had done something incredible. He had given Goliath a voice when the world had tried to silence him. And now, people were listening. The movement to bring Goliath home had started as a whisper, a single child's desperate plea. But it had grown into a roar. News outlets picked up Noah's story, broadcasting clips of the little boy holding his crayon drawings, his voice trembling but resolute as he begged the world to help him save his best friend. The video Sarah had posted spread across social media like wildfire, shared thousands of times by people who had never met Goliath, yet felt the injustice of his removal deep in their hearts. And then, the animal rights groups took notice. One of the largest organizations advocating against breed-specific legislation reached out to the Millers. They had seen this happen too many times before. Loyal, loving family dogs taken simply because of outdated laws, forced from the only homes they had ever known. But there was something different about this case. This time, there was Noah, a 7-year-old boy who refused to back down, whose raw grief had stirred something in the public consciousness. The group wasted no time. They launched a petition demanding that Goliath be returned to his family and that the law be reconsidered. Within days, it had amassed tens of thousands of signatures. Volunteers flooded the neighborhood, organizing rallies, printing T-shirts with Goliath's face on them, handing out flyers to passers-by. Local businesses began putting up signs in their windows. Let Goliath come home. People who had once eyed the massive pit bull with suspicion were now speaking out in his defense. He never caused trouble, an elderly woman who lived down the street from the Millers told a reporter. I saw that dog every day, playing with that little boy. He's not dangerous. The real danger is these unfair laws. One of the Millers' neighbors, a man who had initially been afraid of Goliath, publicly admitted, I was wrong. I judged him because of what I'd heard, not what I'd seen. That dog is no monster. He's family. The pressure mounted. City officials found themselves drowning in emails, phone calls, and letters from citizens demanding action. They had expected the removal of Goliath to go unnoticed, just another enforcement of a rule they believed was necessary. But this was a public outcry unlike anything they had ever faced. And then came the legal battle. A prominent attorney specializing in animal rights stepped forward, offering to represent the Millers pro bono. She was sharp, relentless, and passionate, exactly what they needed. This law, she argued in court standing before a judge, is not based on facts. It is based on fear. There is no evidence that Goliath, or any dog for that matter, should be judged solely by their breed rather than their behavior. The Millers are responsible owners. They have never received a single complaint. There is no justification for removing this animal from his home. The opposition was firm. They cited statistics, brought in so-called experts who spoke about the dangers of pit bulls, the potential risks they posed. But the Millers' lawyer was ready. Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and unwavering, I ask you, where is the evidence that Goliath, this specific dog, has ever harmed anyone? Silence. Because if we are to judge a living creature, if we are to take away their home, their family, should we not do so based on their actions rather than their breed? The judge leaned back in his chair, studying the arguments before him. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Noah clutched his mother's hand, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah felt his grip tighten with every passing second, her own breath caught in her throat. And then, after reviewing the evidence, the judge began, his voice measured, it is clear that the removal of Goliath was based not on his behavior, but on a blanket ruling that does not account for individual cases. This court finds that Goliath poses no threat to public safety and therefore orders his immediate return to the Miller family. For a moment there was silence. Then the courtroom erupted. Noah gasped, his small hands flying up to his mouth, eyes wide with disbelief. Then he turned to his mother, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's coming home?" Sarah was already nodding, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yes, baby. He's coming home." James let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, running a hand over his face before pulling his son into a tight embrace. The attorney smiled, shaking Sarah's hand, and then turning to face the reporters already scrambling to document the ruling. Outside, the crowd waiting for news cheered. The petition had worked. The protests had worked. The people had spoken, and for once, justice had prevailed. And Goliath? At that very moment, he sat inside his cage at the animal control facility, his head resting on his massive paws, unaware that his nightmare was about to end. He heard footsteps approaching. The familiar scent of one of the workers reached his nose before he even lifted his head. The man stopped in front of his cage, looking down at him with something almost like regret. "Well, big guy," the worker muttered, pulling out a key. "Looks like someone fought real hard for you." The lock clicked. The door swung open. Goliath didn't move at first. He had been here long enough to understand that going through that door didn't always mean freedom. But then, a scent drifted through the air, one that sent a shock through his entire body. Noah. Before the worker could even step aside, Goliath moved. His paws hit the ground, his muscles tensed, and then he ran, down the hall, past the other cages, through the doors that had once trapped him inside, and then there they were, Noah, Sarah, James, his family. Noah broke away from his parents, sprinting forward as fast as his little legs could carry him. "Goliath!" The pit bull let out a sound that was something between a whimper and a bark, his body colliding with the boy in an explosion of fur and limbs. Noah wrapped his arms around his best friend, his small fingers gripping at his fur as if he would never let go again. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. James wiped his own eyes, clearing his throat. Goliath was home. The battle had been long. It had been brutal. But love had won. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the pavement as a quiet anticipation filled the Miller household. The air was thick with emotions, hope, disbelief, an overwhelming sense of relief that settled into every corner of their home. Noah stood by the front door, hands clenched into fists at his sides, his heart hammering in his chest. He had been standing there for what felt like forever, his small body practically vibrating with nervous energy. His parents were behind him, watching with quiet patience, but they didn't try to make him move. They understood, and then, at last, they heard it. The low rumble of an approaching vehicle. Noah's breath hitched as the large white truck rounded the corner and came into view. His fingers tightened around the fabric of his shirt, his pulse roaring in his ears. This was it. The truck slowed to a stop in front of their house. The metal door creaked as it was pushed open, and for a moment there was nothing. Just silence, just stillness, just the waiting. Then a familiar shape appeared. Goliath. The massive pit bull stepped forward hesitantly, his muscles tense, his ears flicking back as he took in his surroundings. His paws touched the pavement, and he froze, his wide brown eyes scanning everything before him. He knew this place. He knew this house. But was it real? For months, his world had been nothing but concrete and steel bars. Cold floors, strange voices, dogs that never came back. Every time he had allowed himself to hope, it had been ripped away. So he hesitated. Noah, however, did not. The moment he saw that familiar face, that familiar body, that familiar presence, he moved. "Goliath!" The name ripped from his throat like a burst of light breaking through the darkest storm. His legs carried him forward before he even realized he was running, his bare feet slapping against the pavement as he hurled himself toward the dog who had been stolen from him. Goliath's eyes widened, his body tensed as if he were bracing for something. But then he heard it. The voice. That voice. A sound so familiar, so deeply ingrained in his soul that it bypassed every ounce of hesitation inside him. Noah. Noah was calling him, and just like that, everything else fell away. The fear, the uncertainty, the months of confusion and waiting and wondering. Because Noah was here. Goliath moved. His powerful body sprang into action, his paws kicking up dust as he surged forward, the leash falling uselessly to the ground behind him. And then they collided. Noah's arms wrapped around Goliath's thick neck, his small fingers curling into fur he had missed for far too long. The boy sobbed openly, his tears soaking into the dog's coat, but he didn't care. He didn't let go. "You're back," Noah choked out, pressing his face against Goliath's broad chest. "You're really back." Goliath didn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling. He understood the warmth, the love, the sheer overwhelming relief pouring from the little boy clinging to him. His tail exploded into movement, wagging so hard that his entire body seemed to vibrate with it. His deep, heavy breaths came faster, and then he licked Noah's face. Once, twice. A desperate, eager, joy-filled motion, as if to reassure himself that this was real. Noah laughed, a genuine bubbling sound that broke through the remaining tension in the air. He pulled back just enough to look into Goliath's eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw happiness. And then, something miraculous happened. Goliath's lips curled upward, his mouth parted slightly, his tongue hanging just enough to the side, and there, clear as day, was a smile, a real, unmistakable, ear-to-ear smile, the kind of smile only a dog who has found his way home can wear. Across the street, their neighbor, an older man who had once been wary of Goliath, paused mid-step, blinking in disbelief. He let out a surprised chuckle, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "I thought pit bulls didn't know how to smile." James and Sarah, watching from the doorway, laughed, a full, unrestrained sound, one they hadn't felt in a long time. Because how could they not? Because this was what happiness looked like. Noah pulled Goliath even closer, his hands gripping onto the fur he had feared he would never feel again. "You're home now," he whispered. "You're never leaving again." Goliath let out a deep, contented sigh, pressing his massive head into Noah's chest, and for the first time in his life, he believed it. The story of Goliath didn't end with his return home. If anything, that was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed his triumphant return, the momentum that had built around his case only grew stronger. News outlets continued covering the story, highlighting not just Goliath's journey, but the broader issue of breed-specific legislation. Animal rights groups seized the opportunity to launch national campaigns, using Goliath as a symbol of why these laws needed to change. The world had seen the pain of a child ripped away from his best friend. They had watched a family fight against an unjust law and win. And now, they weren't willing to let the conversation fade into silence. Local advocates organized town hall meetings, inviting officials to hear testimonies from dog owners who had been affected by the ban. Families came forward with their own heartbreaking stories. Dogs they had been forced to give up, pets taken from their homes simply because of their breed, not their behavior. Even people who had once been indifferent or afraid of pit bulls were beginning to rethink their stance. The neighbor who had once crossed the street to avoid Goliath now greeted him with a cautious but genuine smile when passing by. "It's not the dogs," he admitted to a local journalist during an interview. "It's us. We judge them before giving them a chance." The petition that had started as a desperate plea for Goliath's return now carried a bigger message: end breed discrimination. Judge dogs by their actions, not their breed. And people listened. The petition grew from thousands of signatures to hundreds of thousands. It was no longer just a town-wide issue. It was a national conversation. People from different states, even other countries, followed the movement, pushing for similar changes in their own communities. Then one day, the Millers received a letter. It wasn't like the first one. This time there was no cold, impersonal demand to remove Goliath from their home. No threat. No ultimatum. This letter was different. It was an invitation, a request for Sarah and James Miller, along with Noah, to speak at a legislative hearing about the proposed repeal of the breed-specific law in their town. The news stunned them. "We did it?" Noah asked, eyes wide with disbelief when Sarah finished reading the letter aloud at the dinner table. "We haven't won yet," James corrected gently. "But they're listening now, and that's the first step." Noah looked down at Goliath, who sat beside him, his big brown eyes watching the family as if he too understood the weight of what was happening. "We have to go," Noah said firmly, his small fingers curling into Goliath's fur. "We have to help other dogs like him." And so they did. The hearing was held in a large government building, the room packed with activists, dog owners, lawyers, and journalists ready to document the moment. When the Millers entered, they were met with cheers, a stark contrast to the fear and sadness they had once felt in a courtroom just months before. Sarah spoke first, recounting the devastating night when Goliath was taken and the long fight that followed. James followed, presenting facts, statistics, and research that debunked myths surrounding pit bulls. But the moment that truly moved the room came when Noah stepped up to the microphone. At just 8 years old now, he was the youngest person in the room, but his voice carried more weight than any argument before him. "My best friend almost got taken away forever," he said, his small hands gripping the podium. "And not because he was bad, not because he hurt anyone, just because of the way he looks." Silence fell over the room. "My friend is not a monster," Noah continued, looking up at the officials sitting behind the long table. "But you treated him like one. And I don't think that's fair." He turned, glancing back at his parents before looking toward the audience. He took a deep breath, then spoke again. "No dog should be taken from their family just because of a rule that doesn't make sense. So please, change it." The audience erupted in applause. The hearing lasted hours with testimonies from experts, dog trainers, and families just like the Millers. The officials took notes, whispered among themselves, debated points back and forth, and then, weeks later, the ruling came in. By a unanimous vote, the breed ban was repealed. It was one of the first major legislative reversals of its kind in the country, setting a precedent for other states to reconsider their own laws. A year after Goliath's return home, he and Noah sat side by side in their backyard, the setting sun casting long golden shadows across the grass. Life had gone back to normal, in the best possible way. Every morning, Noah woke up to a wet nose nudging his cheek, a reminder that he would never have to face another day without his best friend. Every afternoon, Goliath chased him through the fields behind their home, their laughter and joyful barks filling the air. There were still scars, memories of fear and heartbreak, but they no longer defined them. Goliath was home, and this time, he was here to stay. One afternoon, as they ran through the backyard, Noah suddenly stopped, panting, and turned to his dog. "You know," he said, crouching down so he was eye level with the massive pit bull, "Mom says we helped a lot of other dogs too." Goliath tilted his head slightly, his ears flicking forward. "Dogs like you won't get taken away from their families anymore," Noah explained, because people finally understood. Goliath let out a low, happy noise, his tail thudding against the grass. Noah grinned, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. "We changed the world, buddy." And just like that day when they had first been reunited, Goliath smiled. It was a small thing, a subtle curl of his lips, a glint of happiness in his eyes. But it was real. Because pit bulls weren't monsters. They never had been. It was people who had been wrong. And finally, the world was starting to see the truth. The world often judges what it doesn't understand. For years, pit bulls have been labeled as dangerous, as unpredictable, as animals to be feared. But Goliath's story proved what many dog lovers already knew. It's not about the breed. It's about the heart. Noah, a 7-year-old boy with nothing but crayons and determination, did what so many adults failed to do. He made the world listen. His love for Goliath became a force so powerful that it overturned a law, changed minds, and gave hope to families who had lost their pets to outdated policies. A year after that heartbreaking night when Goliath was ripped away, he and Noah ran side by side across the fields behind their home, just as they always had. The fear, the tears, the battles. It was all behind them now. They had won, and in winning, they had changed everything. One day, as Goliath lay in the warm sun, his tail thumping lazily against the grass, a neighbor, once afraid of pit bulls, looked over the fence and said, "I always thought pit bulls couldn't smile." And right on cue, Goliath lifted his head, his big, powerful jaws parting just enough to reveal a real, unmistakable smile. Because he was home. Because love had won. Because sometimes the smallest voices make the biggest difference. If this story moved you, please share it. Let the world see that no dog, no friend, should ever be judged by their appearance alone. And if you haven't already, don't forget to like and subscribe to Vale Marks for more stories that will touch your heart and open your mind. As Mahatma Gandhi once said, the greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated. Let's choose kindness. Let's choose justice. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay compassionate, stay curious, and never stop fighting for what's right.